grade 6. Today's lesson is called Comparing Decimals, Fractions, and Percentages. We will be working in your Jump Math book on page 131. Our learning target for today is, I can compare and order decimals, fractions, and percentages. Here's a quick review. We've already looked at this slide a couple of times, but just a reminder that we can represent the same value as a percent, a fraction, or a decimal. Today we'll be using the greater than or less than symbols. Most of you are familiar with these, but I just wanted to review a couple of the ways some people remember the difference. So often we think of that alligator mouth with the big, wide mouth pointing towards the bigger number. That is one way that people remember the difference. And when it starts with the big alligator mouth, we say greater than. When it starts with a small portion, we say less than. And of course, if the values are equal, we would use an equal sign. So here you can see when we are comparing 5 and 8, that big alligator mouth is eating the 8. 8 is greater than 5. Technically, we should say 5 is less than 8 because we read the numbers in the same way we would read a book from left to right. In this case, we would say 10 is greater than 4. Some people simply remember that the big open side of the symbol points towards the big number and the small pointy part points to the smaller number. This lesson will also require that we remember how to create an equivalent fraction. So before we begin our lesson, let's review. If we are starting with 1/3 and are asked to create an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 6, what should we do? That's right, we must multiply both the top and the bottom by the same number. In this case, we are given a denominator, the bottom number. So we can ask ourselves, 3 times something equals 6. Well, we know 3 times 2 equals 6. But we must keep this fair. If we multiply the bottom by 2, we must also multiply the top by 2. 1 times 2 equals 2. So 1/3, I'll rewrite this, is equivalent or equal to 2/6. And if we remember back to our fractions unit, this makes sense because if we had a pie divided into thirds and we had one of those thirds, that would be the same as having 2/6. So if I go ahead and cut this pie now into 6, you can see that I now have 2 pieces, 2/6. Let's try one more. If we want an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 12, we must multiply by a different number. So 3 times something equals 12. That's right, 3 times 4 equals 12. We must also multiply the numerator, the top number, by 4. 1 times 4 is 4. So 1/3 is equivalent to 2/6, and it is also equivalent to 4/12. And here we can see a picture of what that looks like using a rectangle. Let's turn to page 131 and get started in our Jump Math book. Question 1 says, is the fraction closest to 10%, 25%, 50%, or 75%? There are many ways that you could tackle this question. I will try to show you a few of these ways. One thing to remember, though, is that you don't always need to find the exact value of these fractions. You're just stating which it's closest to. So for the first one, we're going to use equivalent fractions to create a fraction with a denominator out of 100. That will allow us to directly compare 3/5 to those percentage values. So we know that 3/5 can be made into an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100. We need to ask ourselves, what times 5 equals 100? Well, I know 5 times 2 equals 10, so if I add a 0, 5 times 20 equals 100. If we multiply the bottom by 20, we must multiply the top by 20 as well. 3 times 20 equals 60. So 60 out of 100 we know is equal to 60%. So that is closer to 50% than it is to 75%. So we're going to write 50% on the line. Another way you might want to think about this is with a number line. So let's draw a number line here from 0 to 100%. We know that the middle will be 50, and we've had a lot of practice. We know halfway will be 25%, and then 3/4 would be 75%. Now let's also add 10. Well, about halfway, that's going to be 12.5, so a little bit less will be 10%. So on the other side of the number line, you could add some fractions, or you may just decide to look at the fraction, and you might first think, is that more than half or less than half? So 3/5. Well, if I have 5 objects and I have 3 of them, I have more than half. 5 is an odd number, so we can't have half. So we know it's going to be on this side of the number line. It's going to be more than 50%. However, I can see there are 2 left. So if I divide this whole section into 5, is that 5? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I know that it's going to be somewhere in here. So that is another way to think about it, but you may find it easier to create an equivalent fraction instead. I think that for most of you, using the equivalent fraction method will be easiest all the way up to part J. That may become more difficult when you get to question K and L. So let's try one of those together using a different method. Although we don't always use calculators, like I have said before, it is one tool that we sometimes have available to us, and it can be useful to know how to use that. So let's try K with a calculator. So a calculator can help us with K because 37/40 is simply another way of saying 37 divided by 40. Remember, that line is another way of writing divided by. Sorry, my calculator keeps disappearing. All right, let's give this a try. 37 divided by 40 equals 0.925. So now we have a decimal, but we are comparing it to percents. But we know that those two are interchangeable. So this, there are 2 ways to think about this. We can change this to a percent, or we can think of our percents as decimals. So this is looking pretty high and close to 1, close to 100%. So we could represent this out of 100. So we can see we have 9/10, 200ths, and 5 thousandths. And we can multiply this by 100 to change that to a percent. So to multiply by 100, we notice that there are 2 zeros, and we move the decimal place 2 spots, and we have 92.5%. If you prefer, you can simply think the percents as decimals. We know that 75% is the same as 0.75. 50%, 0.5 0. 25%, 0.25, and 10%, 0.10. So 37/40 has a decimal 0.925. That is certainly closest to our highest value of 75%, or 0.75. So the answer for K is 75%. Now, let's look at L. We see 1/12. So in your mind, you should be thinking that's pretty small. I don't think it's going to be 75 or 50. I'm not even sure if it's as high as 25%. Think about that one, and if you need to, use a calculator to check your answer. Question 2 says, change the numbers in the pair of fractions with the same denominator, then write less than, greater than, or equals in the box. Part A has been done for us, but I think it'll be easier to just go through Part B together rather than review that one. So we are trying to compare 1/2 and 53%. Some of you may already know the answer, but it may be easier to do what they did here and get both written as a fraction with the denominator of 100. Let's start with 1/2. If we are trying to get it to be an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100, let's figure out what we must multiply by to equal 100. 2 times something. I think 2 times 50 equals 100. If we multiply the bottom by 100, we must also multiply the top. 1 times 50 is 50. So 1/2 is equal to 50 out of 100. 53% is a fancy way of saying 53 out of 100. So I'm going to write my two fractions, and then we can decide about the greater than or less than symbol. Well, would you rather have 50 candies out of 100 or 53? I would rather have 53. So we're going to put the larger side facing 53. So 50 hundredths is less than 53 hundredths. I will get you started on Part C and D, and then you can finish those on your own. Let's start with 1/4. If our goal is to get this to be an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 100, we must multiply 4 by 25. Think about 4/4. If you have 4/4 in your pocket, you have 100 cents. Go ahead and finish this by multiplying the numerator by 25 as well. Try Part C and then Part D, which also has a denominator of 4. Question 2 has many parts. I would like you to try, E, F, G, and H. If you would like extra practice, go all the way to L. If not, please feel free to cross out the last row. Question 3 says, write the numbers in order from least to greatest by first changing each number to a fraction. All right, so 3/5 is already a fraction. 42%. We know 42% is the same as 42 hundredths. 0.73 can easily be written as 73 hundredths. Now we have all of these as a fraction. You can also convert 3/5 to a fraction with a denominator of 100, just like we have done in previous questions. So first, we must multiply 5 by 20 to get to 100, and do the same to the top. 3 times 20 is 60. So now we have 60 hundredths, 42 hundredths, and 73 hundredths. Our job is to write them from least to greatest. So the smallest one is 42 hundredths or 42%. And typically you write the numbers in the order, or pardon me, in the form they were in the question. Next, 60 hundredths or 3/5. And finally, 73 hundredths or 0.73. That is your final answer. Please try part B on your own. Part C and D are optional. Put an O-P-T, optional. And that is all for today. Have a wonderful day.